Welcome to the Nordic Africa Institute and welcome to this event on Peaceland, on Congo. And first of all, we are very happy to do this in cooperation with Life and Peace. We have many occasions we do together, and I think we complement each other. The Nordic Africa Institute concentrate on the continental-wide issues on conflict and post-conflict, and then Life and Peace bringing the special research and activities on Congo development. And I was just preparing myself for this event because I was looking at the topic of the book in question, Peaceland. I don't think many of us think peace as the first characteristics when we think about Congo Democratic Republic. And in fact, just a few months ago, one of the biggest Nordic newspapers sent finally a correspondent to African continent, one correspondent, whole continent. And now this guy seems to be traveling around Congo, DRC, and the stories coming are definitely not about peace. So we are very happy that, I hope he was here. But we're also very happy that we have, researchers who are able to bring also a different image of the country, not only what seems to be now circulating in the Finnish media, the mineral conflict and many other characteristics which we often think when we think of DRC. So today we have a very distinguished guest, Séverine Autesserre, who is an associate professor at the Barnard College at the Columbia University. She has now published her second book on DRC, which is also for sale for those interested to dig more deeper into her work. And we also have a discussant representing the Nordic Africa Institute, Maria Eriksson-Bass, who's also a very well-known Congo expert. And what is also very typical, I hope, for our events, that we have a combination of academic and practice here. Both Séverine and Maria has worked also in the practical work when it comes to DRC. We will run this event for 2 hours almost, and we will run it in such a manner that first I will ask Séverine to do her presentation, and then Maria will comment and ask some questions to facilitate the discussion, and then maybe for the last 20-30 minutes we will open discussions for the whole audience. I'm very happy to see so many of you here today, and I'm very certain that it's going to be a strolling event. So most welcome, Séverine, and please, hopefully this is your second time already here in Nordic Africa Institute, so looks like you like it here because you came back. So let's make her feel also welcome by giving her a big applaud.
Thank you so much, Elena, and thanks for inviting me again to present. So I presented my new book, my first book last time I was here. Now I'm going to present the second one, so I hope you're going to like it. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Let me tell you a few words to tell you what motivated the book, what got me started, and 5 years later eventually resulted in my new book, Peaceland. I have spent the past 15 years studying international peace-building initiatives, not only in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also in other African and non-African countries. And during this fieldwork, I constantly witnessed a puzzling pattern, which is that international interveners keep using, reproducing, perpetuating ways of working that they themselves widely view as inefficient, ineffective, or even counterproductive. And by interveners, I mean expatriates who work in peace building. So that includes donors, diplomats, United Nations peacekeepers, and the foreign staff of international and non-governmental organizations. And by peace building, I mean any and all actions that help promote peace during and after a conflict. So when I say peace building, I include all of the actions that United Nations officials would usually categorize as either peacemaking, peacekeeping, or long-term peace building. So let me give you a few examples of these puzzling patterns that recur. It is now conventional wisdom that local ownership is essential for successful peace building, but local stakeholders are rarely included in the design of the international programs. Scholars and practitioners regularly emphasize that using universal peace-building templates is ineffective, and that it's very important to adapt the activities to the context. And yet, interveners often use models that have worked in other conflict zones, but that are not appropriate for the specific local conditions. Local people and interveners themselves often deplore the expatriates' tendency to live in a kind of bubble where they interact mostly with other expatriates and where they lack contact with host populations. And yet, this phenomenon still recurs in virtually all areas of intervention. Why? To me, the persistence of these inefficient modes of operation is all the more puzzling because interveners are not indifferent or callous. Most of them do care a lot about the effectiveness of their actions. They're not stupid. Most of them are intelligent, well-read, well-educated people. Some of them even have a master or a PhD from Columbia University or from Uppsala University. And the thing is that they're not even oblivious to the consequences of their standard practices. Some of them are actually very uncomfortable with the way international peace building operates on the ground. So, my book Peaceland is an attempt at understanding why interveners contribute to perpetuating modes of operation that they know, that we all know, are inefficient, ineffective, or even counterproductive. What I also found striking when I was doing the fieldwork is that a number of individuals and organizations ignore or even actively challenge the international peace builders' dominant practices, and they suggest alternative modes of operation. The existence of these exceptional cases raises two questions for me. First, what can we learn from them in terms of increasing the effectiveness of international peace building? And second, why haven't they managed yet to convince their colleagues to adopt the alternative modes of operation that have proved to be more effective? So, identifying the factors that impact the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of international peace building is of crucial importance to scholars, to practitioners, obviously to people living in conflict zones. It's true that international efforts can succeed only when warring parties are ready to stop using violence, and when local, national, and international and regional peacemaking and peace-building capacities are strong enough to make peace sustainable. But despite their limitations, external contributions can make the difference between war and peace. There have been a number of studies at the macro level and at the very micro level that have shown that international support significantly increases the chances of successful peace building. And so when we look at the usual explanations for the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of international peace building, we see that they usually focus on three themes. First, they focus on material constraints. For example, whether or not peace builders have enough funding to implement all the projects that they need to re-establish peace. They also focus on vested interest. That is, peace builders prioritize either the pursuit of peace, which promote peace building effectiveness, or they prioritize the pursuit of their own personal, organizational, or national interests. And as a result, their projects effectively promote these vested interests, but they have little effect on the actual construction of peace. And the last kind of explanation focuses on the imposition of liberal templates and values. Many scholars argue that Western liberal values orient interventions towards strategies that are ill-adapted to local conditions and therefore ineffective, while peace-building programs that are sensitive to the context are much more effective. What I found in my research, and the central message of the book, is that the everyday dimensions of international peace-building initiatives on the ground also influence very strongly the effectiveness of international efforts. And when I say everyday dimensions, I really mean mundane elements. I mean the expatriate social habits, their standard security procedures, their habitual approaches to collecting information on violence. I also look a lot at the influence of the informal and the personal on formal professional initiatives. And in my book, I show that these everyday practices shape the overall intervention from the bottom up. They enable, they constitute, they help reproduce the macro-level policies, strategies, institutions, and discourses that other political scientists usually study. They also explain the existence and the perpetuation of ways of working that interveners themselves widely view as inefficient, ineffective, or even counterproductive. And I want to clarify from the start that my approach and these other existing explanations are not mutually exclusive, but rather they're complementary. Another important point is that my argument is not that we should eliminate support for international peace builders altogether. There is, in fact, a wide consensus among scholars and host populations that external support and external expertise are often, not always, but often necessary for successful peace building. International interveners have a number of comparative advantages when they are on the ground in conflict zones, and I've listed the most important of them on the slide. So what we need is not to forfeit these contributions, but rather to think about how we can increase the effectiveness of international efforts. So in the rest of this talk, I'll tell you a few words about my theory and research methods and about the main contributions of my analysis. And then I will explain how interveners construct knowledge of their areas of deployment. And I will trace the impact that this process of knowledge construction has on peace-building effectiveness. Then I will move on to identifying the everyday elements that make possible the specific dynamics of knowledge construction and that create really firm boundaries between interveners and host populations. And again, I will trace the impact that these everyday elements have on peace-building effectiveness. And I will conclude by summarizing the policy and scholarly implications of my analysis. Let me say a few words about the main contributions of the projects. I think that there are two major problems with the research on international peace building. First, most scholars focus on headquarters, capital cities, and on the dynamics of intervention at the national and international level, while field-based peace builders enjoy substantial leeway in implementing their on-the-ground operations. Because instructions from capital cities and headquarters must always be interpreted, and because there is often a wide divide between field offices and capital cities and headquarters. So it's very important to study the specific dynamics of on-the-ground peace building. The other major gap is that most scholars focus on macro-level policies, strategies, ideologies, institutions, and discourses. And this focus on the macro level creates two significant research gaps that a focus on the everyday practice of peace building on the ground helps fill. The first one is that we know a lot about macro-level ideologies, strategies, institutions, discourses. But as of now, we know much less about the nuts and bolts of peace building. The banal, the everyday activities that actually make up the bulk of the peace building work. The other major gap is that while we have many fascinating ethnographic analyses of how the cultures and practices of host populations can promote or impair effective peace building, ethnographers have rarely looked at those doing the peace building. So, as a result, we know very little about how the daily lives of the interveners, their social circles, and the way they approach their work on an everyday basis actually influence macro-level actions and strategies. Only a few researchers have started looking at this topic in recent years, but they usually focus on humanitarian aid, development, democratization, space and security, or local ownership. So with my book, I want to contribute to this emerging body of literature by drawing up a portrait of the interveners with their customs, beliefs, behaviors, everyday lives, and practice. And this focus creates findings that are different from those of existing research. Existing research on international peace building emphasizes the differences among interveners. Many political scientists and anthropologists have shown that different cultures orient the strategies of different countries, organizations, or professional groups in dissimilar ways. This precludes the coordination that could achieve coherent strategies, and thus it decreases the effectiveness of international peace efforts in Africa and in the rest of the world. This is true, but at the same time, my research highlights commonalities among interveners, whether these interveners come from Western countries, European, North American countries, or from African countries or from other parts of the world. And I show that these commonalities reside less in shared representations, such as a shared adherence to liberal values, but they lie instead in the everyday practice of peace building on the ground. And these new findings suggest a fresh answer to the question of what affects the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of international peace building. I argue that the everyday practice of peace building on the ground is just as important to study as the content or the ideological dimensions of the programs. And so to document the influence of the everyday on international peace building initiatives, my research strategy has been to spend more than a year in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Congo being, as you know, the theater of the deadliest conflict since World War II. And I did an ethnographic study of a community of interveners based in North Kivu, which was the most violent area of the Congo at the time of my fieldwork and is still the most violent area of the Congo. And because of that, it hosts a very wide variety of interveners coming from all kinds of professional, national, organizational, religious, and other backgrounds. But while this in-depth ethnographic analysis gave me access to the culture of the interveners, I needed to distinguish between those collective understandings that are limited to the community of peace builders based in Congo and those that are shared by all peace builders, independently of where they are deployed. So I conducted research visits to other theaters of intervention. I went to Burundi, South Sudan, Cyprus, Israel and the Palestinian territories, and Timor-Leste. And if you're interested, I'm happy to explain during the discussion why I chose these cases as shadow cases for my research. I also built on my own experience as an intervener in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Congo, and Nicaragua. And of course, I use practitioners' reports and academic writings on many other theaters of intervention. And in my main field sites, I collected 4 kinds of data to develop my analysis. Several years of field observations, 294 in-depth interviews with all kinds of interveners and with local populations, local staff, local authorities, document analysis, of course, and participant observations, which included things like patrolling with United Nations peacekeepers and implementing reconciliation projects with non-governmental organizations. But let's focus on what's really interesting, which is the findings. The first part of my book traces how interveners construct knowledge of their areas of deployment. And I first focus on the struggle over which and whose knowledge matters in Peaceland. In the current international system, the most valued expertise is that of interveners trained in peace building, humanitarian, and development techniques, and with extensive experience in a variety of conflict zones. In contrast, and although there are exceptions, the knowledge of country specialists is usually much less valued, and the knowledge of local people is usually trivialized. International and non-governmental organizations, just like diplomatic and donor missions, usually do not rely on anthropologists or historians who could help interveners gain an in-depth understanding of their work environment. Instead, they hire operational experts who have done the same technical job before. In terms of promotion and status, intervention structures value the number of missions in different countries rather than the amount of time that someone spends in a particular mission. And in fact, the people who stay too long in a specific place are considered to have gone native, and they are thus discredited. The consequence is that of all the expatriate peace builders that I met, only a few had pre-existing knowledge of their countries of deployment. All of the others had been hired for their technical and substantive capacity. Valuing thematic knowledge over country-specific expertise results from various social dynamics, including the process of professionalization of international peace building, which has increased the effectiveness of intervention programs on the ground. However, valuing thematic expertise over local knowledge also results in standard ways of working in the field that decrease the effectiveness of international efforts. For instance, it legitimates the deployment of people who do not speak any of the local languages, even though on the ground, everyone identifies the intervener's lack of linguistic ability as one of the main obstacles for effective peace building. It also leads to high rotation among interveners, which has a lot of negative consequences, such as loss of institutional memory and a lack of understanding of local context. Even more importantly, valuing thematic expertise over local knowledge also asserts the superiority of the international staff, who are viewed as having consequential knowledge, over local employees. In virtually all aid and peace-building organizations, whether diplomatic, international, or non-governmental, expatriates are in management positions, and local people make up the staff. Very few local people make it into leadership position in their countries of origin. If they want to move up the hierarchy, they have to go abroad and become expatriates. And let me tell you a story that illustrates how the very fact of being local changes the way interveners relate to a person and his ideas. One of my interviewees, Michel, was a Congolese businessman. He's still a Congolese businessman. And Michel was very frustrated at the way interveners behaved toward him and toward other Congolese elites. He thought that interveners were talking down to local counterparts and that they didn't take local ideas into account. So during a meeting abroad, Michel conducted an experiment. Instead of introducing himself as Congolese, as he usually did, he pretended that he came from Puerto Rico. And the approach in the meeting was completely different. He had much more credibility and much more influence when he passed as an outsider. Another consequence of the fact that thematic knowledge matters more than local expertise is that intervention structures rarely solicit local input in the design and plannings of their efforts. And this approach creates enormous resentment among local populations And it is at the roots of the phenomenon of local contestation, resistance, and adaptation that leads to the failure of so many international projects and programs, and that other scholars like Oliver Richmond and Roger McGuinty have documented so well. So, of course, local people regularly resist or reject the international programs for their own benefits, to pursue their own personal, military, political, security, business, economic agendas, or just because they don't care about building peace. But not all local people have this kind of vested interests. And instead, many of them truly care about building peace in their country. And many of them would truly benefit from more stable conditions. So it is important to study why people who would in fact benefit from successful peace-building projects instead reject or distort them. And the main reason is the premium that interveners place on thematic expertise over local knowledge. In all of the countries in which I worked, local stakeholders complained that international peace builders were arrogant and that they provided aid in a humiliating manner. And my interviewees emphasized that the arrogance resided in thinking that the international ways of working are better than the local ones, and in failing to pay attention to local ideals. And what's really interesting is that I heard this kind of criticisms against all kinds of international programs. So not only the programs that obviously focus on liberal values, such as programs that focus on organizing elections, but also programs that have no relationships with Western or liberal values, such as programs that use foreign rather than local models of toilets to respond to water and sanitation emergencies. And my interviewees were very clear. They say that they do not resist or reject the international programs because of their content, such as the supposed Western or liberal characters of the programs. Instead, they reject the very act of imposition, regardless of whether or not they like the strategies and the values that the program convey. And the international and non-governmental organizations that fight against this trend are an excellent illustration of the advantages inherent to valuing local knowledge on par with thematic expertise. The few comparative evaluations of their effort that exist show that these organizations are much more effective at promoting initiatives that are locally owned and locally supported, and therefore effective and sustainable. The next chapter of the book studies the everyday manner in which, in these circumstances, international peace builders, those that are not exceptions, make sense of their environments. And I show that interveners face multiple obstacles when they try to collect and analyze data on their areas of deployment. And I trace the key consequences of the resulting lack of understanding, in-depth understanding of local conditions. And one of these key consequences is that the lack of in-depth knowledge of local context entices international peace builders to rely on simple and often overly simplistic narratives to design their intervention strategies. Adopting dominant narratives offer a useful way out of the predicament that international peace builders face given the poor quality of the information and analysis that they have. Adopting dominant narratives enable them to focus on a few themes, and interveners can then believe that they have a grasp of the most important features of the situation, instead of feeling lost and deprived of the knowledge that they need to properly accomplish their work. And in the book, I develop an in-depth case study of the impact of dominant narratives on the conflict in Congo to illuminate the perverse consequences of this practice. So in brief, in Congo, in 2010 and 2011, when I did the research, but even still now, three narratives dominated the discourse on Congo, and they orient the intervention strategies there. These narratives focus on a primary cause of violence, the illegal exploitation of natural resources, a main consequence, sexual abuse of women and girls, and a central solution, reconstructing state authority. Thanks to the reliance on these dominant narratives, foreign and Congolese elites have managed to put the Congolese conflict on the agenda of influential decision makers in capital cities and headquarters. And it's no wonder that they managed to do that, because these narratives were very helpful, because they suggest simple and clear explanations for the violence. They also offer feasible solutions, and they resonate with foreign audience. But the problem is that the reliance on these dominant narratives and on the solutions that these narratives recommended has also led to results that clash with their intended purposes, including an increase in human rights violations. The focus on mineral resource exploitation has diverted attention from other important causes of violence, such as land conflict, for instance. The focus on sexual violence has raised the status of sexual abuse. It has transformed it into an effective bargaining tool for combatants, and therefore it has increased the use of sexual violence. And the focus on state building has merely enabled the Congolese government and the Congolese army to become more effective perpetrators of human rights violations against all kinds of Congolese people. And numerous researchers and Congolese activists, and even Congolese ordinary citizens, have tried to reintroduce more complexity in the discourse on Congo, but thus far with very little success. So the second part of my book studies the everyday elements that make possible these counterproductive practices and narratives, and that create very firm separation between interveners and local populations. And again, I look at the intended consequences of this practice, such as enabling interveners to function in conflict zones and enabling their organizations to help the host country build peace. But I also look at unintended consequences, notably the fact that these everyday routines again create a very firm separations between interveners and local people, and the fact that they perform, they make visible, they perpetuate, they reinforce an image of the intervener superiority over local populations, image that these populations strongly resent. So for the sake of time, let me focus on the three elements that are the most influential in creating this separation between interveners and local people. The first element is that interveners share a common official goal: to help the country of intervention and its people. And it's something very clear from the quote that I put on the slide. Here, we're all part of a club, we're all here to help Congo. So there are, of course, numerous internal differences in the process of reaching this common goal. There are also very different degrees of motivation, but the shared objective delineates the boundaries of the interveners group. It defines who belongs to the community and who does not belong to the community. Foreign business people, for instance, are excluded for the simple reason that they do not share the same official goal. And the interveners group include people coming from all kinds of professional, national, organizational, and religious backgrounds. And what's important is that the presence of this community of interveners does not preclude the existence of the internal divisions and tensions that other scholars have documented. And if you're interested, I'm happy to explain during the discussion how the similarities coexist with the differences. But what's really interesting is that on the ground, two elements transform this loose group with a lot of internal divisions and tensions into an actual bloc with firm boundaries. The first element is that interveners share a common experience of life in conflict zones. And that goes well beyond the shared characteristics that we all know about, such as the fact that interveners drive in big SUVs, that they have favorite bars, inside jokes, favorite topics of discussion. Beyond these superficial characteristics, I showed that the feeling of belonging to a specific community is rooted primarily in the fact of being a foreigner living and working with no family life, constant fear, lack of basic facilities, and usually a job that is emotionally draining. And the quote that I put on the slide is typical of what I heard during my interviews and what I observed and experienced during my fieldwork. In war situations, you are in it together, in a country that you do not know, where people speak other languages that you do not understand. We, local people, we interveners, we interact with local people all day long. But there are times when you want to eat your own food, listen to your own music, speak your own language. And at that point, my interviewee stopped. She looked at me in the eyes and she said, "You and I, we have millions of things in common." You have to realize, I've never met this person before. And clearly we have very different backgrounds in terms of national origins, profession, organizational affiliations. And yet she said, "You and I, we have millions of things in common. You and Congolese, you have 2 or 3 things in common apart from work." This is why the expats go together, because the expats in any country need to have a place where they can go and sit down just so that they are in their own world. It is necessary to keep you sane and anchored. And I heard this kind of deep emotional talk from all kinds of interveners, no matter what functions they had, which organizations they worked for, or where they came from. The other element that helps reinforce the feeling of community among all interveners, despite all of the internal divisions and tensions, is the presence of others against whom interveners construct their group identity. And these others are notably the so-called locals, meaning the local authorities and populations who are the intended beneficiaries of the international intervention. And again, that's something very clear from the quote on the slide. You and I, we have millions of things in common. You and Congolese, you have 2 or 3 things in common apart from work. It's important to note that local people share responsibility for the separation that exists between them and interveners. In many settings, local people treat all expatriates as alike and separate from themselves, regardless of the intervener's national origins, profession, organizational affiliations. This reinforces the sense of community among interveners, and it further widens the split between the 2 groups. In many places, local people also make it extremely difficult for interveners to integrate in the surrounding communities, as you can see, for example, in the quote that I put on the slide. So I love this quote because that's an excerpt from one of the interviews I conducted with the exceptional interveners that I told you about. And this specific person had spent close to 10 years in Congo. She had learned local languages. She had tried to develop strong friendship with Congolese people. She had married a Congolese man, and she had a child who was half Congolese. And yet, she felt that only her husband and her immediate relatives fully accepted her, when none of her other contacts did. And this is a complaint that I heard many times when I interviewed people who were trying to break the boundaries between themselves and local populations. And my point here is that turning to interveners for support is a perfectly understandable response to the daily difficulties of intervening on the ground in conflict zones. It enables interveners to function in the difficult environments that they face, but this habit also has counterproductive consequences that include decreasing the effectiveness of international programs. Take also so many of the other routines that the book studies. The book shows that all of these routines, again, are perfectly understandable response to the daily difficulties of intervening on the ground, but at the same time, they further separate interveners from local people, and they further construct the image of intervener superiority. Take the intervener's common official goal, the fact of having to help be one's primary objective, and identifying local populations and authorities as beneficiaries. This actually embodies a claim to the moral high ground, as was evident in the saying that constantly recurred in my interviews in Burundi, Sudan, and Congo: the hand that gives is always higher than the hand that receives. Take also the intervener's standard security routines, such as driving with the doors locked and the windows closed. These routines are again perfectly understandable responses to danger, but at the same time they further separate expatriates from local populations. In the words of a Kenyan interviewee, they transform foreign interveners into other kinds of human beings. They also reinforce the data collection and analysis problems that interveners face because they decrease the interveners' knowledge of the local realities that they want to change. And in the book, again, I study numerous other everyday practice and routines, such as striving to be neutral and impartial, advertising actions, purposely writing reports, and quantifying the results of actions. And again, I show how all of these routines are perfectly reasonable answers to the difficulties of intervening on the ground. But these routines contribute to the separation between interveners and local people, and to this image of intervener superiority, which local populations, again, very strongly resent. And again, the individuals and organizations who fight against these trends, who develop local, social and personal relationships with their local counterparts, who forego standard security routines and the requirement to advertise their actions, these people end up implementing projects that are much more effective. So to wrap up, the book suggests a new approach to the study of international peace building, an approach focused on the everyday dimensions of international peace building on the ground. This new approach produces findings that are different from those of existing research. Existing research on international peace building emphasizes the differences among interveners, while my research highlights commonalities among them. And in contrast to the body of research on the liberal peace, I show that these commonalities reside less in shared representations, such as a shared adherence to liberal values, but they lie instead in the everyday practice of peace building on the ground. And these new findings suggest a fresh answer to the question of what affects the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of international peace building. Macro-level policies, strategies, institutions, discourses are not the only determinant of peace-building effectiveness. The daily practice of peace-building on the ground also matters tremendously. And it is by looking at these everyday practices and habits that we can understand why interveners contribute to perpetuating modes of operation that they know, that we all know, are inefficient, ineffective, or even counterproductive. Everyday practices, habits, and narratives are perfectly understandable responses to the daily difficulties of intervening on the ground in conflict zones. They enable interveners to function in the difficult environments that they face, but they also have numerous unintended consequences that decrease the effectiveness of international efforts. And of course, I have developed numerous policy recommendations based on this analysis, but I think the time for my presentation is almost up, so I'm just going to take 1 minute to summarize the main ideas. Interveners could rebalance the role of local and thematic knowledge by following the model of the exceptional organizations that I mentioned during this talk. So concretely, that would mean changing recruitment and promotion practices for interveners, relying more on local employees, creating tools and structures to better involve local communities and neighboring communities, and even more importantly, creating tools and structures to gather input from local actors and from the intended beneficiaries. We could also help break the boundaries between interveners and local populations by, again, creating structures for better relationships between interveners and local counterparts, by convincing interveners to socialize more with their local counterparts, and by convincing interveners to forego standard security routines and the requirement to advertise their actions. And local people could further help break these boundaries by changing the way they routinely interact with foreign peace builders. So this is a very brief summary of a 350-page book, and my analysis is of course much more detailed than what I've been able to explain in 40 minutes, so I'm more than happy to give you more details during the discussion if you're interested. Thank you so much.